The summer of 1934 arrived in western Kansas, not with warmth and promise, but with a silence so complete, it felt like the land itself had given up breathing. The fields that had once rippled green and gold now stood brittle and brown, cracked open by a sun that seemed to have forgotten what mercy meant. For the Calloway family, Earl, his wife Mabel, and their 3 children, this was not simply another bad season. This was the end of everything they had ever known, everything they had ever worked for, and perhaps everything they had left to lose. Earl Calloway was 53 years old, though most people who met him guessed a decade older. He had spent 31 of those years farming this same quarter section of land, carrying on what his own father had started and what he had always assumed his sons would continue. But the Dust Bowl had other plans. The well was nearly dry. The livestock were going one by one. The banknote was overdue by 4 months, and the bank in Dodge City was no longer in the mood for patience. Not worn down, not needing a part, utterly, catastrophically seized. The engine block had cracked overnight from heat and age and the desperate overwork of trying to do in desperation what it could barely do in health. Without that tractor there was no planting. Without planting there was no crop. Without a crop there was no loan payment, no food, no future. Earl Calloway stood in that field with his hat in his hands, looking at the broken machine, and knew, or believed he knew, that the farm was finished. About 14 miles east of the Calloway farm, on a forgotten stretch of dirt road that most county maps did not bother to name, there lived a man called Amos DeWitt. He was 46 years old, the son of a sharecropper from Georgia, who had come north looking for something better, and found instead something merely different. Amos had taught himself mechanics from a single dog-eared manual he had found discarded behind a filling station in 1921, and over the following decade he had become something that nobody in that part of Kansas had a proper word for. He could hear an engine failing 3 sentences before the driver could articulate what was wrong. He could diagnose a seized bearing by the smell of the exhaust. He had rebuilt a 1918 Fordson tractor using parts from a discarded hay baler, a hand-cranked washing machine, and a section of water pipe, and that tractor had run for another 11 years. But Amos DeWitt was black in 1934 Kansas, which meant that for all his gifts, most of the white farmers in the county had never knocked on his door. They would drive past his shed on the way to a mechanic in town who charged twice as much and fixed half as well, and that was simply how things were. It was Mabel Calloway who broke that pattern, not because she was blind to the social architecture of her time. She was not, but because she had watched her husband age 10 years in the past 2 months, and she had decided that she was not going to stand on the porch and watch the farm die out of a loyalty to custom that the bank was certainly not honoring in return. She had heard about Amos DeWitt from Cora Hutchins, whose husband Jake had quietly taken his truck to Amos's shed after the dealer in town wanted $40 for a repair Amos had done for $7. Mabel hitched the mule to the wagon and drove 14 miles in the August heat without telling Earl where she was going. She found Amos exactly where Cora had said she would, under the axle of a neighbor's wheat truck, visible only from the waist down. She introduced herself, explained the situation without embellishment and without the careful verbal cushioning that the era typically required in such cross-racial encounters, and offered him what she had: $12 in saved egg money, a promise of whatever vegetables she could spare from the kitchen garden, and her word that the debt would be honored, even if it took the rest of the year. Amos slid out from under the truck, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me what it sounds like when it runs." She told him. When Amos arrived at the Calloway farm the next morning and got his first real look at the tractor, he did not say anything for a long time. He walked around it twice. He ran his hands along the engine block, pressed his ear against the casing, peered through a crack with a small mirror he kept in his breast pocket. Earl stood nearby with his arms folded and the look of a man who has already given up, but has not yet finished being angry about it. Amos finally straightened up, looked at the cracked block, and said something that Earl remembered clearly for the rest of his life. "The engine isn't what killed it. The cooling system killed it. The engine's just where the damage landed." What had happened, Amos explained, patiently, not condescendingly, was a cascade failure that had started months before the crack appeared. The radiator had been losing coolant through a slow, almost invisible pinhole seam leak. The water temperature had been running high for weeks, stressing the metal through repeated heating and cooling cycles. When the hottest days of August hit, the block had simply reached the end of what it could endure. The crack was the result, not the cause. This mattered enormously, because it meant that simply welding the crack, even if you could do that cleanly, which was difficult on cast iron, would solve nothing. The underlying problem had to be fixed, or the new repair would fail, just as the old metal had. Amos pulled out his notebook and sketched the cooling system from memory, as he had already reconstructed it in his mind. He explained each failure point to Mabel, who had stayed close while Earl paced. She asked good questions. She understood quickly. Earl eventually stopped pacing and came to look at the diagram, and for the first time in weeks, something other than despair moved behind his eyes. Here was a man who understood exactly what had happened, and this was the part that felt like something from a dream, seemed to have a plan for what to do about it. But the parts presented the problem. A new engine block for that model of tractor was something Amos could order, but it would cost more than the farm had left in any account, and it would take 3 weeks to arrive. 3 weeks was too long. The planting window that remained was narrow, and getting narrower every day. Amos stood with his hands on his hips and looked at the tractor and then at the sky. That flat white Kansas sky that gave nothing away, and let the problem work in him the way he always let problems work. He had learned long ago not to rush this part. The answer was always somewhere. The answer came to Amos at around midnight of the first day, and it was, by any ordinary measure, an absurd one. There was a 1927 automobile engine sitting in a ravine about 2 miles from the Callaway farm. Amos had noted it months earlier when he drove that road, as he noted everything mechanical that he passed. It had been there long enough that it was partially buried by washed soil, but Amos had seen enough through the rust to know that the block was intact. The engine was from a different manufacturer, a different era, a different mechanical language than the tractor. Making it work in the tractor's place would require adapting 2 entirely incompatible systems. Different bolt patterns, different torque specs, different cooling architecture, different power output. In a factory, this would have been a project requiring an engineering team, a machine shop, and months. Amos had himself, a set of hand tools, a borrowed acetylene torch, and 8 days. He retrieved the engine with Earl's help and a block and tackle rig they improvised from fence posts and chain. They dragged it out of the ravine, loaded it on the wagon, and brought it back to the barn. Then Amos sat down with his notebook and began the calculations that would either save the farm or prove that even he had limits. He worked through the problem in layers. First, the structural mounts, then the power transmission, then the cooling system redesign, then the fuel system modifications. Each layer revealed new complications. Each complication revealed, eventually, a solution. The solutions were not elegant in any traditional engineering sense. They were stitched together from ingenuity and available materials, the way Depression-era everything was stitched together, by people who had no choice but to make the impossible ordinary. The mounting brackets had to be fabricated by hand from flat steel stock, bent and drilled without press or drill press. Only a vise, a hand drill with a dull bit, and a hammer. The cooling system had to be rerouted using copper pipe that Amos bent cold over his knee to the exact angles the new engine geometry demanded. The fuel line had to be extended and fitted with a handmade coupling that Amos machined from a section of brass rod using a file and a makeshift lathe that he built from a wheel hub and a length of pipe. Earl worked alongside him for all of it, doing what Amos told him to do, handing tools, holding parts, and gradually learning, without quite realizing it, more about how engines worked than he had learned in 53 years of farming with them. On the 6th day, they lowered the rebuilt, adapted engine into the tractor frame. It did not fit cleanly. Nothing about this project had fit cleanly, and there were 4 tense hours of adjustments, refabrication, and one moment when Earl put his fist through a barn wall in frustration. But by nightfall, the engine was seated. The mounts were bolted. The cooling lines were connected. Amos checked every connection twice, then a third time. He primed the fuel system by hand, He adjusted the carburetor settings by feel, the way a musician tunes an instrument by ear. And on the seventh morning, with the whole Calloway family standing in the barn doorway watching, Amos DeWitt set his hand to the crank and turned it over. It coughed. It shuddered. It sent a backfire crack through the barn that made all three Calloway children flinch backward. And then it settled into a rhythm. Rough at first, uneven and uncertain, like something that had forgotten what motion felt like and was remembering it one revolution at a time. But it ran. Amos stood beside it with his hand on the block, feeling the vibration through his palm, listening to things no one else in the barn could hear, making tiny adjustments to the throttle and choke until the rhythm smoothed and steadied, and the engine found its voice. It was not the tractor's original voice. It was something rawer and rougher and somehow more honest, the sound of two incompatible things that had been forced, by necessity and ingenuity, into an impossible harmony. Mabel Calloway put her face in her hands and her shoulders shook. Earl stood very still, and tears ran down the creased planes of his face, without him making any move to stop them. The oldest boy, 12-year-old Thomas, quietly walked to the tractor and put his hand on the warm metal flank of it, as if to confirm that it was real. Amos stepped back, wiped his hands clean on a cloth, as he always did when a job was finished, and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. The engine said everything that needed saying. The tractor ran that entire fall planting season without a single failure. The adapted engine proved, against all reasonable expectation, to be more durable in the Kansas heat than the original had been, partly because Amos had redesigned the cooling system from scratch rather than simply patching the old one, and partly because a borrowed automobile engine from 1927 turned out to have slightly better metallurgy than the original farm equipment specification had required. The Calloways got their crop in. It was not a full crop. The season was too short and the soil too depleted for that. But it was enough. Enough to make the loan payment, enough to keep the bank from the door for another year, enough to plant again in spring. Word traveled the way it always travels in farm country, slowly, person to person, along dirt roads and over fence lines, and through the particular silence that falls when neighbors are close enough to hear each other's troubles. By the following spring, Amos DeWitt had more work than he could manage. Farmers who had driven past his shed for years now drove to it deliberately, and while there were still those who would not, the world does not change all at once. Enough did, that Amos was able to expand his operation, hire a young man from a neighboring county, and buy the one piece of equipment he had always needed and could never before afford. But this story is not only about Amos DeWitt, remarkable as he was. It is about all of them, the unrecorded fixers and rebuilders and improvisers who held rural America together through its worst decade, with nothing but skill and stubbornness, and the particular kind of courage that never makes headlines because it does not look like courage from the outside. It looks like a man with a wrench under a broken machine in August. It looks like a woman driving 14 miles in the heat because she refused to believe that the only options were the ones she had been offered. It looks like an engine turning over in a barn when everyone in that barn had stopped believing it would. History tends to remember the grand gestures, the legislation, the programs, the figures who stood at podiums and promised relief. And those things mattered. But what actually kept the farms running during the Dust Bowl years, what actually preserved the thin thread of rural American life when everything was trying to sever it, was this: neighbors helping neighbors, knowledge crossing lines that society said should not be crossed, ingenuity filling the spaces that money and policy had left empty. Amos DeWitt never received a government contract. He was never photographed by the Farm Security Administration. His name does not appear in any county record that we have found. But the Calloway farm survived. The tractor that Amos rebuilt ran for 19 more years. Thomas Calloway, the 12-year-old boy who had put his hand on its warm flank that morning in the barn, eventually learned to repair it himself, taught informally and over many seasons by Amos DeWitt. When Thomas had children of his own, he taught them too. The knowledge passed quietly and without ceremony from one generation to the next, the way real knowledge always does. The engine that should have been impossible is gone now, melted down in the scrap drives of World War II. but the understanding it represented, that problems have solutions if you look at them from a different angle, that help can come from unexpected places if you let it, that the impossible is often only impossible until someone decides it is not. We built this country on the labor of people whose names we did not write down. We kept it running through its hardest years on the ingenuity of people we did not photograph, or celebrate, or remember. This is a story about one of them, but it stands in for thousands, the mechanics and the midwives, the seed savers and the well diggers, the women who made $12 do the work of 40, and the men who made broken engines sing again. They are the forgotten heroes of rural America. They deserve to be remembered, and the least we can do, the very least, is to say their names.